Welcome to the Age of Fission radio show with your host, Lonnie Clark. We stand together and accept that we now live in a world transformed by Fukushima. From 8 a.m. to 9 a.m. Pacific Standard Time here on UCY.TV radio. We relentlessly engage every ear that listens. We expose and confront the complete lack of accountability for the nuclear industry. Consider social engineering programs who view our bodies, minds, and souls as assets on a balance sheet. We discuss vital current issues, interview activists, and engage our audience in an effort to allow all voices to be heard. The Age of Fission radio show creates a venue that all will choose. We encourage our listeners to reclaim their power and their courage to take action and save our planet from the ravages of greed and indifference. Our actions matter. Every voice matters. We remind our listeners that happiness is resistance. Love is greater than fear. Good morning, UCY.TV radio listeners. This is Lonnie Clark with the Age of Fission radio show. Thank you for joining us. Today is May 29th, 2018. It's 8 o'clock in the morning here in Eugene, Oregon. And thank you for joining us. We really appreciate it. And we want to thank KEPW.org for carrying our radio show. And we actually want to tell you can reach KEPW at 97.3. So we want to thank everyone for joining us. Today I'm very excited. We have a new friend of the show, Mark Robinowitz. He's an activist. I have known about Mark. I haven't known him very well. He is here from Eugene. He's a writer. He's a political activist, ecological campaigner, and a permaculture practitioner. I first saw Mark Robinowitz, I think it was at a city council meeting, because when I first came to Eugene, I used to go to all the political events. And wow, thank you, Mark. I'm very excited to have you join us.
Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, so Mark has a website that I would love everybody to go to. It's oilempire.us. And he has, you can kind of explore his avenues of thinking. And that's what I appreciate about you, Mark, is you think differently. A lot of times you rub people the wrong way, but in a way, it's a great part about your thinking pattern is you go against the grain. So I want to thank you for that, for being willing to be yourself.
Well, I've been concerned about nuclear issues most of my life. I was a teenager when 3 Mile Island happened, and that set me on the contrary path that I'm on today. From there, I graduated to being concerned about nuclear war. Ronald Reagan and George Bush were in the White House and wanted to understand what sort of society would tolerate aiming hydrogen bombs at cities. And from there, trying to understand the politics and then the psychology of it led me to connect the dots in ways that are not popular in our society, which is numbed to the threat of nuclear pollution and nuclear confrontation. Unfortunately, these crises have gotten worse, as you know, and they are scary, and rather than face our fears about them, we have engaged in several flavors of denial that have made the problems much worse.
That is so well stated. That's why I really appreciate you, Mark Robinowitz. Thank you for making that clear statement, because people are numbed to nuclear pollution. You know, yesterday was Memorial Day, and I said, let's take a look and see what we can talk about on Memorial Day in regards to nuclear. So I thought I'll look up the nuclear veterans. And I searched the internet and I found a story from 2011, AARP, in which it was a good story but very detailed. But she explained that this stunned me. As I was reading the story, I went, what? Over 500,000 nuclear veterans. There were over 500,000 nuclear veterans. 500,000 of our soldiers. That's a lot of soldiers.
Well, and I've had the privilege of meeting a few of them at peace events, not recently, since I think most of them have passed away. But one in particular I heard about 30 years ago was in the Marshall Islands and saw the largest U.S. nuclear test ever. And he said he was about 35 miles away, and when the flash went off, he could see the bones in his arms that were over his eyes. He had
his eyes closed. He had his eyes closed, so he saw through his eyelids, through his flesh, to his bones.
That was the claim that he made.
Wow.
And the legacy of manufacturing these devices at Hanford and the other places around the U.S. and similar places in Russia and other countries have left us with a lethal legacy, even if we decide never to have a nuclear war and disarm 100% and have peace and happiness for everybody.
And shut down every nuclear plant. Right.
We're still left with the legacy, whether we, even if we elected Dennis Kucinich for president or someone like that.
Well, I think it's a whole new industry. We have a whole new billionaire industry for them to make a lot of money off, is figuring out how to solve the pollution issue, how to reverse it, how to remediate it. Although Charlotte Anthony, who I think you know, says the answer is microbes. Microbes.
Well, microbes work on a chemical, microremediation and bioremediation work on a chemical level, but not so much on a nuclear level, a subatomic level. Some of the toxic materials can be undone through these natural processes, but as far as we know, ionizing radiation from nuclear decay, whether from power or weapons or the mining of uranium ore and so forth, that takes time. Other than time, we do not know of any way to neutralize this material.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps it can be stabilized. 3 years ago, I took the public tour of Hanford along with a number of other peace activist types and a number of members of the general public. And they drove us around all day long on the Hanford reservation. We saw the first reactor. We saw their new dump that they've made. And it's a horrifying experience. But at the same time, I felt a certain, I'm not even sure the word, sympathy, perhaps, for the scientists who spend their days trying to figure out how to stabilize this stuff. And I wish them well. And that, to me, is more of a concern than if the contractors are gouging the Department of Energy for profiteering. That might be a scandal, but that's really not the concern that I have. You have all this liquid nuclear waste that's slowly leaking out into the groundwater. And if they rip off the taxpayers but can stabilize it, well, that's more important.
Right.
My concern is that they're going to rip off the taxpayers and not be able to stabilize it.
Well, I've said that I think that they are ripping off the taxpayers because they have no idea what they're doing. So, like, they've said they could do this. So, okay, let's keep saying we can do it. But they really, honestly, the science is way ahead of them. They're not there yet.
Well, the single biggest project at Hanford right now is the plan to build the high-level waste vitrification facility, which it will take some of the worst of the nuclear waste in the tank farms and smelt it at high temperatures and turn it into glass. And I haven't heard anybody suggest, well, what happens to the stuff at 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit? How much of it will escape as air pollution? And as I'm sure you know, and many people know, the downwinders from Hanford have suffered greatly over the decades since the 1940s. I mean, maybe the liquid stuff does need to be in glass form, but how do you get it there? And glass is not a permanent solution. It's good on a human life scale, maybe, but even the shorter half-life stuff, cesium and the strontium, it's dangerous for centuries. It has a 30-year half-life. It takes many half-lives to decay to a point that it's no longer a problem. And then you get plutonium, which is forever.
You know, this is the interesting thing, is as a simple-minded person, like when I hear that plutonium has a half-life of 24,500 years or something incredibly, I think, isn't there any way to reverse the action, like at the scientific level? You know how they say you can't stop it? There must be a way to stop it, because they created it, don't you think? That's my thinking.
That would be nice. I hope it's true. But as far as is known, it's a one-way process.
Kind of like drilling a hole, kind of like taking a piece of pristine wood and drilling a nail in it. You can take the nail out and put some putty in it, but you never really make it the way it was.
Maybe a better analogy would be you take that piece of wood and you put it in your wood stove and it becomes ash. There's no way to turn it back into the wood.
That's a much better analogy. And that
but even that's not a great analogy, because it's a whole new mode of physics that wasn't really understood until a little over 100 years ago. Plutonium was first invented around 1942, and we haven't, as Einstein said, the splitting of the atom has changed everything except our mode of thinking. Thus we drift towards catastrophe. And we haven't really incorporated the profound meaning of the discovery of fission into our thinking about how we behave in the world. It's not that nuclear is the only threat to civilization, but it's probably the least easy to cope with.
Mm-hmm.
You know, compared to, it's much easier to deal with climate change than plutonium.
Yeah. Well, this is what I've said. I actually have a protest sign that says, what was that climate change protest object or something like that. No, we did a No Nukes Northwest. We inserted No Nukes Northwest in it because I think that the exclusion of nuclear contamination on our planet and what it has done to the atmosphere, like the nuclear denial by the climate changers, stuns me. They don't want to say that Fukushima is, I told Dr. Busby, I said, it's interesting when you say that, oh, no, Fukushima couldn't possibly be affecting the ocean. We're like, at the time, we were 5 years in. They're dumping lots of water. There's a lot of contamination. That just the rainwater, the snow, we're talking serious contamination. And I think at a microscopic level, it's not like it's killing the fish, but at a microscopic level, it's killing the microscopic life, which is messing with the biology of the ocean.
Well, it's going up into the gene pool, and what the long-term consequences of that are is impossible to say precisely, but the main difference between Chernobyl in 1986 and Fukushima in 2011 is that Chernobyl's reactor core, after it blew up, melted down into the basement of the facility, but it didn't melt into the aquifer, so it's in a dry condition.
And there was only one.
And it was only one, whereas Fukushima was 3 meltdowns, all of which went into the aquifer, and now they have this reverse Midas touch situation where the contamination just spreads and spreads and spreads, like dumping a bottle of motor oil into a pond. It just continues to spread and diffuse.
Well, that's the other thing, Mark, is people don't realize that it's still ongoing. They're like, oh, yeah. They think it's kind of like Hanford, right? Because here in the Northwest, people have gotten used to like, oh yeah, that's Hanford up there, that contaminated radioactive site, but they're managing it. It's being handled. It's been buried. That's what they think as it is at Fukushima. They think in Fukushima that it's seriously been handled, that it's not that big of a deal. Because people are moving back in.
Well, they're being forced to move back in by the Japanese government, which doesn't want to...
Coerced, actually. They're being coerced.
Yes. And
it's outrageous.
Fukushima is also... The thing that bothers me the most about it is ultimately the dispersal of the contents of reactors and fuel pools over the long run is likely to happen at every reactor site. Fukushima...
That's exactly the beginning.
And if the Japanese nuclear industry, which is as good as any in the world, is having a difficult time handling this, I mean, who would handle it better? Their technological sophistication is as good as anybody.
I actually hadn't even thought of that. Now you created a whole new a whole new level of anxiety for people listening to this. Well, that is hilarious. I'm sorry, but that just made me laugh, Mark. It's 8:00 in the morning. People are having their coffee, and I'm like, oh, really? I hadn't thought of that, because you were right. They are probably very technologically advanced. And can you imagine?
They're as sophisticated as anybody else. It's not like some country that's poor and has very few indigenous technological expertise. They are, they're as equal as anybody in the world, and they are having an enormous problem handling this.
In these articles that we read recently, they say experts told them that they should dump their water, like their new plan with all those tanks is to refilter them again, get out as much contamination, but they can't get out the tritium, and then release the tritiated water into the ocean. That's their plan, but that's like 2020. That's what they're talking about.
Well, the one good thing about tritium is after several decades, most of it's gone. But the longer-term impact on fisheries is, and particularly for a country like Japan, which is very dependent on eating fish from the ocean. But one lucky thing for Japan is the reactor was on the downwind side of the island. If it had been on the upwind side of the island, there'd be a big gash of depopulation across the island.
That's true. That is true. Although some of the people from the prefecture itself ran directly into it, so they were most harmed. But the whole thing, you're right. But
most
that
of it
forest,
went to the ocean.
The forest can't get decontaminated nearby there. I mean, it's kind of sad. That's exactly though what happens. But I think you're right about this. Is like, what would we do? I mean, for goodness sakes, this is why what do you think about Pete DeFazio being able to, or Ron Wyden or Jeff Merkley having any impact on Patty Murray and Maria Cantwell to close down the Columbia Generating Station because it's what I call the proximity factor?
Well, these politicians and the rest of Oregon's delegation are pro-nuclear power. Peter DeFazio and our two senators and the other representatives all co-signed a letter to the Obama administration praising the plan to give almost $250 million to the NuScale Corporation of Corvallis, which seeks to build...
When did they do that?
I'd have to go back and check, but I think it was 2013 or 14. But they are completely in favor of this, as long as it's built not in Corvallis.
Are they for the NuScale?
They're all for NuScale. And when I asked Representative DeFazio about this at a town hall meeting, his response was to urge me, sarcastically, to vote for Art Robinson if I didn't like what he was doing.
Well, I'm going to meet with his office. I'm going to ask for an appointment to meet with his office and Ron Wyden and Jeff Merkley. And I just met with their office about closing down the Columbia Generating Station. I met with Dan Whelan of his office. Me and Louisa Hamachek went in there. And seemed surprised. He's like, we had not heard anybody talk to us about this. He goes, I worked for Jeff Merkley's office for 8 years. We'd never actually thought about the proximity, how close no one had ever brought that up to us, how close the Columbia Generating Station is to Hanford. And if there's an earthquake, no one can get into Hanford. If there's an earthquake and we have a meltdown, let's just say it's not even a major catastrophe, but it has to shut down for 2 weeks. There's a meltdown, some radioactivity gets out. There's a 25-mile exclusion zone that if you go in, you will die. So you have to wait for 2 weeks, period. So no one could get into Hanford near the Hanford site. And some of those tanks...
I don't think the people at Hanford are going to be terribly deterred about that. And my biggest concern about Columbia Generating, perhaps they'll have an accident, but even if they don't have
the money,
then the reactor will continue making high-level nuclear waste until whatever time it finally closes, whether that's in a few years or a few more decades. And we will have this lethal legacy for our grandkids. And that is, to me, the real danger of these facilities.
See, I think the real danger is the earthquake. We know it's coming. There is going to be an earthquake.
That's a different earthquake than what would happen at Hanford, though. They're not the same earthquake.
I don't even mind a small but CGS cannot sustain a 6.0 earthquake.
Well, we'll see.
Yeah, I guess we will see.
But I'm much more interested these days in the psychology that allows these types of things to continue rather than...
Right.
I spent many years and
decades
arguing over the details.
Right, I'm kind of with you on this scene.
That our society is not interested in details, whether you're liberal or conservative or Democrat or Republican or, for that matter, green. The details of what's going on, most people are what Swami Beyondananda calls not sees. We do not want to see. And it's that not see problem that has gotten in the way of any kind of coherent societal response. We have a societal form of PTSD, thinking about nuclear annihilation, climate change, the murder of our president, the complete collapse of our political system, and the constant distraction of the entertainment industry keeps most people from giving any thought to anything.
And let's don't forget about the pharmaceuticals keeping everyone stringing along. I mean,
that's a form of distraction in some cases.
Yeah.
But there's a Navajo proverb I came across that says, "You can't wake someone up who is pretending to be asleep."
That's right.
And merely providing more information does not change most people's response.
I am with you 100%. Like, I am sick of listening to the details, but I really appreciate this conversation, and that's why I was very excited to have you on, because I knew you'd bring it back here, because this is keeping it real. We are in a serious cultural crisis, and we have some very serious physical damage that's being done to everything on this planet right now, and more to come that we can't really escape. We don't quite have the technology to. I mean,
most of it actually, we do have ways to reverse it, and we all know at some maybe subconscious level that the resources going for destruction and war and competition, if we shifted as a species, not just as a co-op
culture,
but as a system-wide practice, and we use those resources for reversing whatever damage we can, reforestation, permaculture on a global level, using do we really need to be spending 3/4 of federal research and development money on more ways to kill each other? I think we've already figured out how to do that. What further expertise do we need in the technology of mass murder? We don't need that. And for a number of years, I've tried to bring this back to the parallel universe when I was born. And this sounds grandiosely personal, but I was born the day after the Cold War was called off in 1963. We had a president who went to the United Nations and gave the most incredible speech any president's ever given, calling off the Cold War, calling off the nuclear arms race, and saying our technology should be used for life instead of death. And he even offered, excuse me, he even offered to convert the moon race into a global cooperative effort with the Soviet Union. And of course, 2 months later, our president was dead, and the new president didn't make such promises, and instead drove us into Vietnam, where we killed 3 million people and split the country socially. But what if the Cold War had been ended 54, 55 years ago? And what can we learn from that now? And this is even less popular than talking about Fukushima or Chernobyl, because it requires us to recognize that the biggest secret of the removal of our president from office is that the perpetrators understood they would probably get away with it due to fear and confusion, and most important, the complicity of the media and the political class, which has steadfastly refused to do even the slightest investigation of this that was meaningful.
Mm-hmm. Even recently, weren't some documents resealed? They're like, oh, no, those cannot be released again for another 40 years.
Well, that's not quite what they said, but yeah. But we don't... There was an investigator, the one time that Congress looked at this, it was called the House Select Committee on Assassinations in the late 1970s. And one of the investigators was named Gayton Fonzie, and he passed away a couple of years ago. But one of the things he said afterward is, well, we basically know what happened. We just don't have all the details.
Mm.
You know, if you have a big sickness, you don't need to understand every cell in your body. You just need to know the basics of what's happened. And for our society, we know that it was a coup. We know that Kennedy tangled with the generals. We have the transcripts of some of his meetings in the White House, because he secretly recorded them. And we know that he stood up to the generals and blocked a nuclear war from happening. And Khrushchev, in the Soviet Union, suffered a similar fate afterward, although he was allowed to live in obscure retirement, unlike President Kennedy.
I don't think many people really quite understand that was how it transpired, that he really did block a nuclear war. I think that's one of the things that, people think. And
there's definitely a leftist critique to make of some of Kennedy's policies, but that's almost irrelevant. What matters is what the generals in the Pentagon thought and the Central Intelligence Agency, because they had a more profound critique, and they acted on their concerns and removed him from office. This is not conspiracy theory, quote unquote. It's merely unpleasant facts that contrast with the narrative that, oh, well, we're the great democracy and we have some problems, but we just need to have more protests and more petition signings and vote for good Democrats or vote for the Greens and things will get better.
Yeah.
The last couple Democrats we've had as national leaders have facilitated the growth, the metastasization of the military-industrial complex. Bill Clinton was a disaster for these concerns, and Obama had a CIA background as well, who came in saying...
I mean, we can even go back to... wasn't it Jimmy Carter who was told by George Bush Sr., no, you don't have access to information in the CIA. You're only the president. Was that him, or was one of those earlier presidents, Reagan or Carter? And that stunned me when that came out, because I thought he should have stood up to them and said, no, I'm the executive authority over everything. I'm like, that is how the Constitution was written. But that
our Constitution went up in a mushroom cloud after Hiroshima.
That's exactly right.
You mentioned before we went on the show how the Manhattan Project was the origin of the secret government, which is completely correct.
Yeah.
They spent,
and how we're still living it. We are still, and when you say that the American people are numb, it really is like the Stepford Wives. It's really weird. You ever go into Richland and it feels like the Stepford Wives up there. But that is reflective of the American people. They are numb. And we are living in the secrecy of the Manhattan Project still. Even the political activists are, if you say even the N word to them, you just say the word nuclear or anything, their eyes just glaze over. It's like...
Well, I found it very interesting that NewScale is one of the nuclear startups in the United States. It's been...
That's right.
Its office, at least, has been headquartered in Corvallis for a number of years. And there's been virtually no mention of it. Our local papers have barely mentioned it. The environmental groups, a couple of them have said they don't like the idea, but I'm unaware of any that have prioritized it as something to be concerned about. And I think
maybe that's something you and I should do. Are you interested? What kind of activities do you think are effective? That's a good question to ask you, because you've been an activist for a long time. What type of activities? I mean, I know you were at the hearing where we were last year, where the room was packed with people, and everybody gave their statement in the Capitol, and everybody, they actually allowed every single person to speak. So that seemed to have stopped that effort to build the SMRs, although, we know they'll come back.
Well, that was a temporary success.
Mm-hmm.
Probably the most success I've been involved with, at least in Eugene, over the last 20 years of living here, was preventing the proposed West Eugene Parkway from slicing up the wetlands north of West 11th Street. But that was because of fairly unique and rare circumstances. The earliest environmental laws from the 60s were much stronger than the ones since then. And there was a law that said you can't build a highway with federal funds through parkland. It's called Section 4F. It was signed by LBJ in 1966. And the West Eugene Parkway violated every law that you could think of that applied to violate it. So I found when I raised that with the highway department, they suddenly got much more respectful towards my concerns. And eventually they cried uncle and withdrew the project. That law doesn't apply to the new highway project that the city of Eugene is pushing to do a massive widening of the Beltline Highway, because there's no park in the way. And it's a bad idea, but the law doesn't prevent it easily. The only thing that will prevent it is a lack of money for the construction. And maybe that will happen, and maybe not. The law on nuclear is pretty difficult, to put it politely. But the biggest issue is you can't even get these groups to focus on it. And I think part of it is the environmental movement has morphed into a climate-only focus.
Mm-hmm.
And the most famous activist on climate is Mr. James Hansen, formerly of NASA,
mm-hmm.
who
pro-nuclear.
He used to be a really good climatologist. I remember his speech to Congress almost exactly 30 years ago this week. It was a hot day in Washington. It was kind of appropriate to talk about global warming and the greenhouse effect. But in the last decade, he has become an ardent pro-nuclear proponent to the point of saying that people who do not want new reactors built are a threat to the planet. That was what he said to incoming President Barack Obama. And I think the reason that he has said that is not that he thinks we should all get radiation sickness and die. It's that he recognizes that living solely on solar panels and wind turbines is not going to power our endless growth economy, and he is in a desperate floundering to try to figure out what to do instead. Now, I've used solar panels from small to now big since 1990. They're great, but they're not going to run aviation. They're not going to run warplanes.
Yeah, but don't you think they could use magnetism? There's people that have invented power sources.
Well, then they need to publish these claims to see if they're real. And even if they are real, that someone's got some new free energy system, we have also used up the best mineral ores. We have used up the best forests.
Get exactly what you're saying.
And half of the ocean are on their way out. And exponential growth is at the heart of our overconsumption. Now, maybe we could use solar and wind and whatever new technology someone claims to have invented to power a steady state economy where we act like we're not having a going out of business sale on planet Earth. But that's not what we're doing. And oil, in a way, was our free energy source. It was there for the taking. We mined it. We had world wars with it. We've had global consumerism with it. And now it's peaked. I mean, the easy oil is gone for the most part. That's why we're fracking and drilling offshore, and we drilled in Alaska, although that's on its way out. And so now we're into the hangover phase from the 20th century and going, what do we do now? And we could have heeded the warnings around the time that Kennedy got removed from office that there were ecological limits. And we ignored those warnings and pushed through. I mean, Jimmy Carter, for all of his benefits and faults, tried to warn the public about the energy crisis, and he was quickly thrown out of office because people didn't want to hear we might have to change the way we live. And
That's
so people like Hansen and the big environmental groups, who are creatures of the foundation world, they're not funded by the public, the big ones. They get their money from big foundations. That's where most of it comes from. So they have to do what they say. And they're deathly afraid of telling people you will have to change the way you live. And at one point it was a choice, but now that we have 7.5 billion people and the resources are being drained, it's going to be forced on us whether we like it or not. And it's that involuntary aspect that scares the oil out of the people who run the world. This is a major reason for the increase in surveillance in the police state, because the Pentagon and their allies, they've studied this for decades. It's not a surprise to the smarter people who run the show. They've been anticipating this all along. And rather than have a more cooperative attitude on how to share and use our smarts and technology and resources to benefit everybody, it's a mad scramble to control what's left. And, we were at a movie last week, All Governments Lie, and it was complaining that, they lied to get us into Iraq. Well, yeah, of course. But the movie didn't attempt to say, well, why did they lie? What was the motive? What was the reason? And the reason is crystal clear. They wanted to get U.S. troops in place to control the oil as we pass global peak oil. That's pretty straightforward. There's no mystery to it. But it's an unmentionable, even in the peace movement, to say, maybe Dick Cheney had a reason to do this evil deed.
Well, of course, to me, that's kind of obvious why they did it. That's like a given. Wasn't there like a secret code name when they first got into this, that the acronym was OIL, Operation Iraqi Launch or something like that?
Liberation.
Yeah, I was like, how ridiculous. The acronym was OIL. That they had to change it. It's kind of like Whoops. Columbia Generating Station used to be called Whoops. Whoops. Well, it's only 12.7 miles from Hanford.
But this has been U.S. policy through decades.
Yes.
And the Democrats, like Clinton in particular, and Carter, bless his heart, they were involved in helping to set up the stage for this, too. Jimmy Carter did some good things, but he also threatened nuclear war over the oil in 1980 in the State of the Union address.
Right.
So
Jimmy Carter had a constitutional crisis that he did not address when the CIA told him he couldn't see access to the files. He should have called, and we should have had a constitutional crisis then. So since then, see, I feel like the whole thing has just been a shenanigans since really since what's his name, said, the warning. He wasn't telling us what would happen. He told us what did happen. And
Eisenhower's warning about the military-industrial complex came because he was trying to get understanding of what General Curtis LeMay at the Strategic Air Command was doing with the nuclear weapons. And Eisenhower sent his scientific advisor, who worked at the Manhattan Project, George Kistiakowsky, to investigate. And LeMay said, "I'm not telling you." Kistiakowsky replied, "I'm here representing the president." LeMay said, "So? I don't care." And they compromised. And LeMay told him what the war plan was for Moscow, which was 60 hydrogen bombs. And Moscow's a big place. Maybe one's not enough to destroy it. But that's madness that makes Hitler's Holocaust.
Say that again. Wait a minute. The president's envoy went to the military man? Is that who he was talking to? So the Pentagon. He went to the Pentagon.
Curtis LeMay was the mad bomber of Japan. He firebombed Tokyo. And
why did the president allow that? Why did he not arrest that person?
Because he realized that he didn't have the power to do that. The president is a temporary position.
Well, that is when I honestly, if we're going to talk reality, considering the gravity, that is probably the biggest act of treason I've ever seen in my life. To be frank, the gravity of the situation had never been presented to any previous president. And that is something that as an American citizen, I would have expected my president to demand, and actually, if he had to, call on troops to arrest those people, whoever it was. And that, yes, that would have been a constitutional crisis.
Well, Curtis LeMay pressured President Kennedy. Excuse me. It's pollen season, and I'm suffering from it. Curtis LeMay pressured Curtis LeMay pressured President Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis to launch a preemptive attack on Cuba, which would have resulted in nuclear war, because the Russians already had nuclear weapons in Cuba, which they would have fired. And we have the transcripts of this because Kennedy realized he was being lied to and put a recorder in the Oval Office. LeMay got his revenge the following year in Dallas, and the night after Kennedy was killed, they had the autopsy at Bethesda Naval Hospital, and LeMay flew to Washington to attend the autopsy of his enemy, gloating and smoking a cigar during the whole thing. And there's a whole backstory on the manipulation of the autopsy, which we don't have time to get into, but the bottom line is, there was a peace activist in Washington who I knew for a quarter century named John Judge, and his mom had been a whistleblower at the Pentagon. She had been tasked with helping to provide the draft figures for the Joint Chiefs. And in early 1963, she was told that the war in Vietnam is being scaled back, we're pulling out, and make your projections accordingly. The weekend after Kennedy was removed from office, she was told, nope, new plan, we're going into Vietnam full scale, plan for a 10-year war with 57,000 dead. And she complained all the way to the Joint Chiefs of Staff and was told, those are the figures, you will use them. And he used to have commemorations in Dallas every year. I went to 2 of them. He is deceased, unfortunately, now, of health complications. But he used to get asked which direction the bullets came from in Dallas. And his response was, they came from the Pentagon.
Oh, wow. So LeMay had a hand in it. That's essentially what you're saying. LeMay was one of the real directors of this. I know who LeMay is. I saw a film called
dropped,
Half-Life, and he is a crazy-looking lunatic.
And he was also the commander of the forces that dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
That's right.
He is probably best known, if anybody still can remember him now, as the running mate for George Wallace in 1968.
I did not know that.
But he was less, I think, motivated by racism like Wallace was. His motive was he wanted to use the nukes to cement America's running the world, which is, in my view, worse than mere racism. I mean, I think there's an connection between the two.
Yeah.
But where the peace movement is these days, they want to focus on racism and sexism and so forth, and that's laudable. But we also have plans for nuclear omnicide, which the missiles tick 24 hours a day. They're ready to go.
Mm-hmm.
And now there's fear, justly so, that Donald Trump might wake up in a bad mood one day and order them to be used. And we'll have to see if the military would be insubordinate if that happened or not. Maybe so, maybe not. But the idea that we have this system ready to go, the idea of that, there's really no words in the English language to describe how insane that is. Not even in poetry. It's a totally unprecedented situation. And the one time we had a president who really put his life on the line to try to undo it, he was removed from office.
Mm-hmm.
And I am disappointed that the left, the peace groups, officially don't really want to deal with that because there's not a simple answer. There's not a
Well, they concede before they get started. It's kind of like, I called when they passed the Unpatriot Act. I used to call Ron Wyden's office all the time. I was really very upset by that. And I said, you know what? You need to break the secrecy and the silence because they were like, well, we can't talk about Fukushima anymore because that's a national security issue. And that's under the Patriot Act now. I'm like,
he voted for it.
Right. And I went, I basically said, you know what? You're telling me you cannot tell your constituent what the status is and what our health risks are, that it's a national security. You can't tell me what my health risks are and the security of our nation from it because it's a national. That does not make sense. I said, if you break the silence, you get 3 or 4 senators, they are not going to come and arrest you. And if they do, we need to have you arrested. You need to stand up for our country right now. And they were like, well, thank you, ma'am, for your opinion. We'll let the senator know.
Well, half the Congress is deathly afraid of what's going on, and the other half is cheerleaders. And it doesn't neatly split only into Democrats and Republicans, although that's one way of looking at it. They are feeling quite powerless. And every time that Congress has tried to do investigations of the national insecurity state, they've been squelched, rendered ineffective, and they do not have power over the 3-letter agencies, which have become the real government. That is
I think that's kind of obvious to us, anybody looking at it, I want to get back to your website. We have about 10 minutes left, 9 minutes left. Your website, I'd like to direct people here. It's called oilempire.us, and you have some little buttons, and people can just click on that. And a political map, connected dots, limited hangouts, best evidence, and disinformation. This is one of the things, like, it is, in a way, it is kind of like a big, huge spider web, isn't it? Like, it's all sort of interconnected, but not.
Well, some of it is complicated and difficult, and some of it is crystal clear. One of my main themes that I try to stress is what's called binary thinking, that something is either yes or no. If you don't like Democrats, you vote Republican. If you don't like Hillary Clinton, then you vote for Donald Trump, or vice versa. And that is a simplistic way of viewing the world, which happens to be wrong. The media echo this, where they say, oh, well, we interviewed both sides of the story. There's a great quote from the late Molly Ivins, who said, well, that's like looking at a situation and you see someone says cat and someone says dog, and the truth is there's an elephant. So the movie we saw last week, All Governments Lie, presented the false dichotomy that there's the corporate media, and over here, wearing the label of the good guys and girls, is the alternative media, which is exposing the full truth. But I see it more as what Nixon called a limited hangout, which means you expose part of the truth in a way that people think the whole truth has been revealed. You also have the rise of the disinformation media, where they make up stories that are usually extreme right-wing. Sometimes there's pieces of truth embedded in them, but then you have these debates between the official story versus outrageous nonsense.
Or you get the confusion of people, like they get kind of gaslit. They can't tell the difference between, in alternative media, between made-up stories and real reporting. And honestly, I saw that movie. I was there, and I saw Jeff Cohen. Jeff Cohen was here 3 times. I enjoyed his talks, and I appreciate their point of view, but I think he's kind of like, these are the... See, I was never really part of that peace activist movement, so I have a whole different take. Like, I'm about their same age, but I never got engaged in any of it, and I'm like what I call a flaming liberal. Like, I've been following, like, I actually, Jeff has a website called Fair and Accuracy in Reporting. I went to their page. I watch Counterpunch. I listen to Counterpunch, and that's their podcast. And I actually got a list of the
Counterspin.
It's Counterspin. That's right. It's not Counterpunch. It's Counterspin.
Counterpunch is a different.
That's right. And I read that one too. Counterpunch, Counterspin. But I appreciate his website and their point of view. Although I agree with you in some ways that it's limited.
Level understanding. So they'll say the war on Iraq was wrong, but they never talk about peak oil as a motive. They'll say that surveillance is wrong, but they fail to notice that it's been going on for a very long time and that there's a motive behind it. And I asked Mr. Cohen when he was here about Wayne Morse, our local former and long departed senator, who was told by Kennedy that we were pulling out of Vietnam because Kennedy realized it was a mistake. And, of course, that withdrawal order was rescinded immediately after he was removed from office. Cohen said there was no truth in that, and I said, well, we have the declassified documents. It's not a question of theory. Even McNamara admitted to that, who was a war criminal in many ways. The North Vietnamese are admitted to that. There's no question that Kennedy, despite all of his faults, signed the order to withdraw from Vietnam, and you won't find that mentioned at Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting and Institute for Public Accuracy, their websites. You won't find that at Counterpunch either. I've looked. Over the weekend, the Washington Post ran a.
Did you send them those pages?
Yes.
Really? Okay.
But it conflicts with their paradigm of how the world works. So it's not a question of sending them more facts. They've made up their mind, and mere facts are not going to change it.
Kind of like Nancy Pelosi. That's the standard Democratic. They're talking about, like, standing up to this. We need more facts.
Well, Nancy Pelosi and the rest of Congress actually voted for Trump to win the Electoral College, despite credible documentation that voting machines were used to flip some of the swing states.
Mm-hmm.
But the last thing I wanted to stress, as we're running out of time, is on Saturday, the Washington Post, which is not my favorite publication, ran a very good article that interviewed Robert Kennedy Jr., who has finally admitted that Sirhan Sirhan, the accused and convicted assassin of his father, actually did not shoot his father, that he has now met with Sirhan in his prison and is troubled by the idea there was a second gunman, which some of us have been saying for decades, because the evidence is crystal clear on that. And so the motive is actually more important in the forensics of how many bullets were fired and the bystanders who were hit and so forth, is that Robert Kennedy was killed on the cusp of becoming president. He had just won the California primary, and he probably would have won and probably would have beaten Nixon. And he had said privately to his assistants that he wanted to reopen the investigation into his brother's assassination, to President Kennedy's assassination. There was a man named Jim Garrison, who was the main character in Oliver Stone's JFK film, which got viciously attacked by the right and the left. But the film, because the film was quite accurate, and Garrison warned that Bobby Kennedy needed to come clean about his understanding of what happened for his own safety. But he was afraid to do that in public because he knew the media would beat up on him. And sadly, Garrison's prediction was correct. So a friend suggested, after reading the Washington Post article, he would be surprised to see the left alternative media pick up on this story. And I hope he's wrong, but I think he's right. Because admitting decades later that the government killed the Kennedys, killed Martin Luther King, and had a hand in Malcolm X's murder as well, then they might fear that someone would ask, well, why have you ignored it all these years? Why did you ignore it when it would have made a difference?
Exactly. And that's the military coup that happened. I mean, we've experienced a military coup, and people don't want to admit that. That's actually, it's that, and in fact, that's one of the things I've discovered since I've been doing this whole journey down this nuclear discovery about what's the real truth. That was kind of my journey. Is like, let's just talk about where we're at. And the more I've discovered it, the more I've realized, wow, they really know exactly what they're doing. This is not an accident. There's no way you could ignore these facts. But like the 500,000 nuclear veterans yesterday, I think the article said they have about 5,000 disability claims that have actually been covered. And partly because when people attempt to do it, they have to have the records have been lost. And there's so much, and the government and there's no money to advertise to find them. And now, as you say, many of them are dying. But well, look, Mark, we are in our last minute, so I want to thank you for joining us. This has really been. Go ahead.
I'd like to close on a somewhat optimistic note. I was just at a conference back east talking about 50 years since Martin Luther King and Kennedy, and proposed that given the lack of political transparency, we could emulate what they did in South Africa with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where perpetrators of these kinds of crimes were given amnesty if they were willing to tell all in public. And it's long overdue in the United States. Most of the ferment about this...
I have to cut us off. We have 10 seconds, but that's a fabulous idea. Please come back and let's talk about it. Let's put your courage feet on, because that's what it takes, is courage to do the Truth and Reconciliation. Thanks, Mark, for joining us. Put your courage feet on. Talk to you guys soon.